So why do people have the political attitudes they have? I mean, some attitudes are downright weird or make no sense for that person. I've been bamboozled by this for a while, so I decided to spend a year and a large amount of money studying it. Honestly, I haven't fully figured it out yet, but please join me as I tell you about some of the things that shape political attitudes, both the ones you'd expect and the ones that maybe you wouldn't. Before I properly get started, I want to thank my Instagram followers for helping me choose this topic. To help me choose future topics and generally consume more political psychology content, check out my Instagram. It's @Political-psych-abby. You can also ask political psychology questions in the comments of this or any of my other videos. Anyway, back on track, we should probably start with the role of self-interest. After all, if we're just all out there taking rational political stances all the time, then I can end the video early and leave everything to the rational choice theory economists. Spoiler alert, almost nothing should be left to rational choice theory economists. Still, self-interest does seem to play a significant role in shaping political attitudes on at least some issues. A study by Doherty, Gerber, and Green found that people who had won more money in lotteries were more hostile to estate taxes and marginally more hostile to wealth redistribution in general. This is kind of hilarious when you consider that lotteries are a form of wealth redistribution, mainly from the poor to the lottery companies and the government, but still. Franco, Tilbert, and Whitco found that people with lower incomes were more likely to support a Washington state ballot measure in favor of a redistributive tax increase, although partisanship and concerns about inequality were also important factors. These are just a few examples, but they indicate that even when it's narrowly defined, self-interest can matter. You mostly win this round, imaginary rational choice theorist I'm arguing with in my head, who definitely isn't a version of my dad from 12 years ago. It is also important to mention that many studies have found that self-interest plays a role alongside other factors. Funk found that self-interest and societal interest values both play a role in determining public policy opinions. Importantly, she found that societal interest moderated the relationship between self-interest and policy preferences. This suggests that self-interest may play a role in determining attitudes that is not completely straightforward and unimpacted by other factors. Rennie and Sears found that the decision to purchase health care under the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, was impacted by both self-interest and symbolic politics. Symbolic politics refers to a number of emotion-laden predispositions, including partisanship, ideology, and racial attitudes. Many of the contributors to attitudes discussed later in this video can be considered part of the larger whole that is symbolic politics. Returning to the study at hand, self-interest had more of an impact on the practical decision to purchase healthcare than it did on public opinion regarding health policy. This suggests that self-interest may be more relevant in situations that are more directly and concretely personal and practical than abstractly political. This study also shows us that people are often hypocrites, but hypocrites deserve healthcare too. Isn't that what the Hippocratic Oath is about? How much of a role self-interest plays may also be dependent on the way an issue is presented. Chong, Citrin, and Conley found that attitudes regarding a number of topics were affected by priming. Priming is where one thing influences someone's response to another thing, without that person deciding that it should. Anyway, Chong, Citrin, and Conley found that self-interest mattered more when people are made clearly aware of their own stakes in a policy and when they have been primed to think about personal costs and benefits. What this indicates is that how relevant self-interest is to determining someone's attitudes probably has to do with the circumstances under which those attitudes are being formed and expressed. Okay, now we can finally move on to why self-interest simply isn't enough to explain political attitudes. Quite a few studies have found either a minimal effect of self-interest on attitudes or none at all. I'll give just a few brief examples now. Sears, Lau, Tyler, and Allen found that self-interest had very little impact on either policy preferences or voting relating to a wide variety of issues. Regarding economic self-interest more specifically, Sears and Funk found that economic self-interest generally has very little effect on mass political attitudes. They did find some instances with clear and substantial stakes, like personal tax burden or dangerous threat, where self-interest played a role. But even in these instances, there was not often a strong effect. They also found that self-interested effects, when present, rarely extended beyond very specific issues and had little impact even on policies related to those issues, let alone more general politics. So, self-interest seems to only matter when people think something will directly and strongly affect them, and even then, it isn't the only factor. Some scholars define self-interest much more broadly. And of course, if you define self-interest more broadly, it'll seem to have a bigger role. Chong posits that adherence to the norms and values of groups often serves self-interest because acceptance by groups confers benefits on individuals. He also argues that individuals are more likely to associate with groups in accord with their own interests. Whedon and Kurzban take these ideas a step further in arguing that if group interests are not considered self-interest, this defines out the possibility of self-interest being a major determinant of political attitudes at all. Whedon and Kurzban also argue that self-interest should be viewed socially and culturally in addition to economically. It does make a tremendous amount of sense that people have individual interests beyond the economic domain, and that those interests would be relevant to their attitudes. However, these social and cultural interests may themselves constitute attitudes, which in and of themselves may not be fully or at all shaped by self-interest. So, quite a few of the factors I'll talk about later are debatably a form of self-interest, although I'd argue that a framework primarily concerned with self-interest may not be the best way to examine them. Sorry, I had to get pedantic there. I promise it gets more interesting from here. In a few minutes, I may even offend someone. Regardless of whether or not they are considered an aspect of self-interest, group identities do seem to influence political attitudes. Huddy details how both political identities and demographic ones can lead to groups with norms of political activity. These groups can have an important role in shaping the political attitudes of their members. Whedon and Kurzban discuss how people generally support policies that are favorable to their demographic groups. They discuss this in terms of self-interest, but it is important to note that not every policy that benefits a group someone belongs to is going to specifically benefit that person. The divergence between self-interest and group loyalty can be seen more clearly with voluntarily joined political groups than involuntary demographic ones. One could easily question which way this influence goes regarding groups that are joined voluntarily, especially political ones. Are attitudes shaped by political groups, or do people just join political groups based on their attitudes? There is evidence that the groups themselves can have some surprisingly strong effects. Cohen found that attitudes towards a social policy depended almost entirely on the stated position of one's political party rather than the content of that policy, which, while good in that it proves my point about groups shaping attitudes, is probably not a great thing for the world. I should mention, though, that generally groups with norms and the ability to shape members of those groups is how people are able to form positive social movements as well as mutually supportive communities. So while group membership can make people do silly things, it is in no way inherently bad. Okay, now we're going to ask the question, values, do they matter? Well, broad value systems do seem to correlate fairly strongly to different sets of political attitudes. Graham, Haight, and Nozick found that people who hold liberal attitudes, which in this context means left of center, rely more on the harm and fairness foundations, whereas conservatives tend to endorse the 5 foundations that make up the moral foundations model more equally. On this graph, blue is liberal, red is conservative, and green is me. You can try and guess my politics from this graph if you're so inclined. Anyway, moral foundations theory has great potential to help understand divergences in attitudes between liberals and conservatives, especially regarding issues relevant to the more conservative moral foundations of loyalty, purity, and authority. Moral foundations theory is really useful if you want to understand the parts of right-wing ideology that many would class as puritanical nonsense. As with self-interest, Chong, Citron, and Conley found that reliance on values informing attitudes may be situationally dependent, with people who have a smaller stake in an issue being more likely to form their attitudes based on values. This does not at all mean that values are not an important determinant of attitudes, as people very often have political attitudes about things that do not affect them at all personally, or where the personal consequences are quite unclear. As Rennie and Sears found in their study of healthcare purchasing, more symbolic politics, including values, can still play a role even when the personal consequences are clear and significant. So yeah, people do have values and morals, and often they even stick to them when doing so is against their self-interest. Pity those morals aren't always good. Sometimes they are, though, so it's probably good we don't operate on pure self-interest. Now we move on to the part of the video where I absolutely demolish my hypothetical rational choice theorist. This is the fun bit where we're going to talk about some attitude-shaping factors that are definitely not rational. One of these factors is cognitive ability. A meta-analysis of 67 prior studies by Henriette et al. Found a relationship between lower cognitive ability and right-wing attitudes, especially authoritarian and ethnocentric attitudes. I told you I was maybe going to have to offend some people. This is that bit. I'm not calling all conservatives dumb. Some are just evil. Some are probably neither. Anyway, obviously this is a difficult subject on which to declare causality and a tense subject to talk about. There is no clear reason why having right-wing attitudes would lower someone's cognitive abilities, but it is theoretically possible that lowered cognitive abilities and right-wing attitudes are both caused by some third factor. If we're going to say lower cognitive ability might make someone more likely to be right-wing, we should probably figure out a causal link as to why. The authors do identify possible reasons for a causal link between lower cognitive ability and right-wing attitudes. The authors of the study explain how people eventually give up or become frustrated by tasks that exceed their cognitive resources. This may lead people to simpler ways of thinking and more traditional worldviews, and in turn to conservatism. Another factor that shapes political attitudes is personality. Multiple traits on the Big Five personality scale have been found to be linked generally to left or right political attitudes. The Big Five personality scale is commonly used by psychologists and includes the traits openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Conscientiousness has been found to be closely tied to conservatism by multiple studies. Openness to experience has been found likewise to be tied to liberalism. Two other traits especially relevant to political attitudes and personality are right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, both of which are linked to being politically right-wing. Fairly obviously, right-wing authoritarianism is a bad thing. Social dominance orientation is also bad if you want to live in at least a somewhat equal society, which I for one do. You may be asking yourself if there's a common psychological trait on the left parallel to right-wing authoritarianism. You may also be asking if the field of political psychology is just a bunch of people sitting in a room saying mean things about conservatives. We actually had a long discussion in one of my classes about bias in the field and whether or not there is such a thing as left-wing authoritarianism, psychologically speaking. I can promise you that psychologists have looked for it. Thing is, it doesn't seem to exist to the same extent as right-wing authoritarianism, even on the far left. Sometimes facts are just biased like that. Anyway, back on topic, whether or not social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism are, in and of themselves, personality dimensions, has been challenged, with many saying they instead represent a set of social attitudes. However, these traits have been found to be linked to much less clearly political personality traits. Social dominance orientation is linked to low agreeableness, and right-wing authoritarianism is linked to low openness to experience and high conscientiousness. Attitudes on more specific issues have also been found to be linked to Big Five personality traits. For example, Milfont and Sibley found that pro-environmental attitudes were linked to the personality traits of agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. If you're interested in learning more about the psychology of environmental issues, I've got a video about that. Connections between personality and political attitudes have also been found by studies not using the Big Five personality scale. Chirambola and Leon applied the Hexaco model of personality to understanding political attitudes. The Hexaco model of personality is similar to the Big Five model, but importantly for the subject at hand, also contains an honesty-humility dimension. Chirambola and Leon found that the honesty-humility dimension was related to voting for left-wing parties. Well, I am not making right-wingers feel good in this video, am I? I'm not doing it intentionally. Sometimes the facts are just like that. Also, I am in a sassy mood today. Honestly, if you're right-wing and you've made it this far, I genuinely applaud your open-mindedness. Emotions, especially threat, also seem to play a role in shaping political attitudes. Henriette, Donde, and Van Heel were able to find a causal link between feelings of threat, especially external threat, and right-wing attitudes. They also found that feeling more externally threatened made people higher in right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. Interestingly, they also found that higher levels of right-wing authoritarianism were related to feeling more external threat later in time, which leaves open the possibility of a very nasty feedback loop of fear and authoritarianism. Regrettably, another thing that seems to shape attitudes is prejudice. Arguably, this is an example of attitudes shaping attitudes. However, prejudice can go much deeper than explicit political attitudes, even being subconscious. So its influence is worth studying independently from conscious attitudes. Citron, Green, Mustang, and Wong found that feelings towards Hispanics and Asians were significant determinants of restrictionist attitudes towards immigration. They did find that beliefs about the state of the national economy and anxiety about taxes were also factors. So we cannot say that prejudice is the only factor in this case, but it is one worth noticing. By the way, that study is from the 90s, but a lot more recent studies get very similar results. Opposition to immigration is much more frequently bigotry than it is economic anxiety, and we've known this since literally before I was born. So can we please stop pretending bigots are just worried about the economy? Although, of course, economic anxieties can get tied up in bigotry, but that's really too big a topic to cover here. Kinder and Ryan found that both implicit and explicit racial prejudice had significant effects on the political attitudes of Americans. Negative attitudes towards egalitarian racial policies were largely explained by explicit prejudice, with implicit prejudice playing a smaller role. Interestingly, effects could also be seen on issues that are not explicitly racial, with support for guaranteed health insurance among white Americans declining after Obama indicated he supported it. During this time, attitudes regarding healthcare became much more correlated to racial prejudice. The effects of prejudice on political attitudes go far beyond the examples I have given here, and could likely fill several much longer and sadder videos, only some of which I'd be qualified to make. So what's the takeaway here? Well, basically, it's that the politics of the people around you aren't usually rationally self-interested, but neither are yours, or mine for that matter. Sometimes that's very bad, but it can also be good. We are not just selfish bastards. We have tremendous capacity to be moral, altruistic, and community-oriented. We probably should not judge the merit of an attitude based on the rationality of the process that led to it. However, this is not to say that all attitudes are equally valid, or arrived at by equally valid processes. We should be aware of when attitudes stem from the more negative aspects of human nature, and be willing to honestly call them out. I hope that learning a bit about where attitudes come from is something that you might find useful. Also, this video isn't remotely exhaustive, so if you want me to do more about this topic or delve deeper into anything I talked about in this video, please let me know in the comments. Please comment your questions below, and if you liked the video, please like and subscribe.